Welcome, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Brandy Jansen. I'm a faculty at the University of Iowa in the College of Public Health, and I have an affiliation with our Environmental Health Sciences Research Center, and I see some familiar faces out there from our Science Cafe series. We are the EHSRC that puts on the Science Cafes in Mount Vernon 3 times each semester, usually down at Fuel. But this was a little bit bigger, and we thought we might have more folks attend this. So. Welcome to our forum, our community forum on water quality issues in Iowa. It's a big topic. I have a feeling we will have a lot to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done today. So we are hosting folks from the National Institute for Environmental Health Science from North Carolina, the Research Triangle area of Raleigh-Durham. They came all the way to Iowa just for us. Yay, we're excited. So please welcome them. And we spent a great day, had a really nice afternoon visiting some farms in the area. So we were down at Donna Warhover's farm, Morning Glory CSA. Tim Keegan hosted us at Brolig Farms, and then we were up at Alan Malley's farm just north of town. And so to really give our North Carolina friends a picture of what Iowa agriculture looks like. Our conversation tonight, and I'll let our panelists introduce themselves in a few minutes, is on the wide open topic of water quality, just to sort of facilitate a conversation. We all know this is our probably our biggest environmental conversation that's going on in the state right now, and particularly in rural communities, it is top of mind. And so this is a really great opportunity for those of us here in Iowa to sort of communicate to some folks in our federal agencies what the issues and concerns are here, and also, of course, just to have a good community event together, which we do very well here in this state. So thanks to everyone who helped host. Joe, who's been a big help. He's helping people find seats. Thanks, Joe. And also to my partner in crime, Jackie Kernick, who's done a lot of the legwork of putting this together. She's done a great job. So I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they do. I've got a couple of introductory questions, then we'll really turn it over to you. I hope you all have a lot of questions and some conversation. So, Tim, do you mind starting?
Sure.
Put him in the hot seat.
I don't have to stand. You have to. There's no.
You don't have to stand.
Oh, it's on? Alrighty. Thanks everybody for coming. Like Randy said, my name's Tim Keegan. Farm with my family, just south of Mount Vernon is where our main farm is. Right around about 3,500 acres is what we currently farm. Row crop operation consisting mainly of corn and soybeans, and then we also run a commercial cow herd of 150 cows. So my background, I guess, is I grew up outside Cedar Rapids, always been in agriculture one aspect or another. Went to Iowa State for 4 years and then got a master's from Kansas State in agriculture. Met my beautiful wife and now farm with her family. And been farming full-time for about 10 years. Before that, I worked for Cargill, did nutrition work all across the country for them, and been involved in many different aspects of the agriculture, I guess. Again, you know, we are conservation-minded people. That's really something that's been taught to us, and probably the biggest thing is we're about 100% no-till, do a lot of different practices, participate in a lot of different programs, really just try to look at the different aspects of agriculture. We talked earlier today when we were on tour, one of the things that we do a lot of is precision technology and some of the things that come with that as far as applying nutrients. And if we get in that today, I love that subject and love talking about it. So again, just live south of town, about 2 miles. I've recognized a lot of faces here and welcome everybody here and looking forward to the discussion.
Good evening. My name is Ken Sharp. I'm with the Iowa Department of Public Health. My current role is I'm the division administrator for the Division of Acute Disease Prevention, Emergency Response, and Environmental Health. And yes, it is as long as it sounds in terms of responsibilities. Just to kind of give you an example of the breadth of items, just today I've been in Manchester talking about emergency response and preparedness issues such as infectious disease outbreaks and hospital preparedness types of activities. A little while ago, I was in Davenport talking about opioid crisis, and here I am talking about water quality issues. So you'll have to forgive me if I slip in an EMS issue or two or something of that nature. We have a wide variety of issues as you might imagine, I'm just one of 5 divisions, and we have a couple of other divisions that are equally large and equally diverse in terms of the other types of things that we deal with in public health. A little more specific to my background, I started with the department in 1993 after a little flood event that we had that took out the Des Moines Water Works for a period of time, and many of you are, I think, aged enough that you remember that. I won't call out any names or ages particularly, because that means I've been here 25 years myself. Since that time, we've also done a lot of work with county health departments, local boards of health, about a variety of environmental health issues, water quality among them. Most of our work is really related to private water wells and on-site wastewater systems in cooperation with the Department of Natural Resources. And we partner a lot with the various state agencies, including the various programs at the University of Iowa, as well as the State Hygienic Laboratory on a number of issues. Our real specialty is data and providing data to communities about any number of issues, including some environmental health data that we have. And so we can get into that a little bit more, but in that time, since 1993, I've added some additional responsibilities to include the things that I introduced initially in terms of the broader role and responsibilities of the department. But we certainly have a piece of the responsibilities in looking at water quality issues, and it really revolves around data and data use. So with that, I'll turn to my partner to the next.
So my name's Chris Jones. I'm a research engineer with IIHR, Hydroscience and Engineering at the University of Iowa. The main purpose of my job is to manage the university's network of water quality sensors that are deployed mainly in streams around the state. There's about 55 of them that we have. Then we also manage some sensors for the Agricultural Research Service, which is part of USDA, and then Cole College and Grinnell College and Iowa DNR. All that data streams into what we call the Iowa Water Quality Information System. And so anybody with access to the internet can look at that and see what water quality is at any of these sites in real time. And we also harvest data from the USGS network of water quality sensors, and they have about 10 in the state of Iowa. So this system is really one of its kind in the world, and is a great tool for researchers and then for the general public that would like to see what water quality conditions are. Then I also do a little bit of research here with my collaborator Keith, mainly on contaminant hydrology related to nutrient and sediment transport, and then studying this nexus between agriculture and water quality in the state of Iowa.
Hello, everybody. My name is Keith Schilling. I am your Iowa State geologist, so not Iowa State, the state of Iowa geologist. Exactly. I do have degrees for both, so I feel like I can make that joke anytime I want. So, I'm the director of the Iowa Geological Survey. We're located at the University of Iowa, actually within the College of Engineering and under IIHR. So, you know, the Iowa Flood Center, we're the Iowa Geological Survey, and there's a bunch of other units. So our job is to look at Iowa's natural resources and both characterize them and figure out the best way to effectively manage our soil, bedrock, and water resources of Iowa. My background is started out in contaminant hydrology and more of an environmental focus and Superfund, and then I, 20 some years ago now joined the Iowa Geological Survey, and I've really appreciated kind of studying the landscape perspective on contamination. I've done a lot of work with Chris and others on water quality issues in Iowa, looking at land use effects and water quality. One of my projects over the years has been looking at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge. Who has been there in Jasper County? One of the largest tallgrass prairie reconstructions in the country. So we've looked at what's happened as that tallgrass prairie has replaced row crop, and so some of the water and hydrology issues. We also do a lot of work with groundwater. We're probably your state's principal resource for groundwater information, both the aquifers of Iowa, the water quality, and the sustainable use. The Geological Survey brings a pretty broad, big picture perspective to some of these issues.
So, I thank you all for being here. I'm Linda Birnbaum, and I'm director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. I think you heard a few minutes ago that we are in what I usually call the southern part of heaven, otherwise known as Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We are one of the institutes of the National Institutes of Health, and we are the only one that is not headquartered in just outside of Washington, D.C., so it makes us a little bit different. I am really delighted to be here, but I have to tell you all, this is not my first visit to Mount Vernon. I was actually here about 11 plus years ago when one of my best and favorite graduate students comes from Mount Vernon, and she was married here. So I had the pleasure of being here. I believe it was in August 2008, so it was after you had the terrible flooding you had then. And I know there's a lot of flooding going on in parts of Iowa right now, but I don't think this area has been as impacted as the southern kind of tier. I really want to thank the University of Iowa for bringing everyone together, and thanks again for you all being here. This is it's hard to believe, my 25th community forum, and everyone is different. I mean, I've kind of done them all over the country, north and south, east and west, including Alaska, and I think each one brings new insight for me. So our health is our environment, or our environment is our health, but human health or disease is really the result of complex interactions. There is nothing that is just genetic, and there is nothing that's just environment. There's always an interaction between the two going on. So environmental factors such as what's in the food that you eat, the water you drink, and the air you breathe are easier to identify and often easier to work with than genetic factors. And so there's a tremendous opportunity there to prevent different kinds of disease. So NIEHS research spans the range of research from very, very basic biology, where we try to understand how the body really works or how a disease starts, to toxicology, exposure science, and human epidemiology. We're unique at NIH, not only because we're not near Washington, D.C., but like I think Ken said, we span the total gamut of health and disease and the relationship with the environment. There are other institutes that deal with, for example, there's an institute that deals with cancer. There's an institute that deals with your heart. There's an institute that deals with your eye. There's an institute that deals with childhood, and there's another institute that deals with aging. We deal with it all, which makes it very challenging, but also very exciting. But the other thing that makes this different is that our focus is really on preventing disease rather than having to treat and cure it. At least my grandma told me last century that, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So over the last 5 years here in Iowa, we've funded over $32 million in research. Just in 2018, we spent about $20 million in research related to rural health, about $52 million in pesticide-related research, and some $100 million just last year in research related to water pollution. At NIEHS, we understand that many environmental health concerns, such as the ones that you have here in Iowa, occur at the intersection of humans and animals and the environment. So our research often takes a One Health approach. So we consider all of these factors so we can develop solutions that not only improve people's health, but also help to ensure the health of animals and the sustainability of our environment. So I am very excited to hear about your concerns today about water quality, and if you have others, I'm happy to hear those too. After all, our water, our air, our food. All of this is part of our environment. And after all, we are all entitled to safe water, clean air, and healthy food. We know that our environment is our health. Okay, I've said enough. I think it's important for me to listen. So listen to what you all are saying. Some of our best research that we do is the result of strong community participation in the research process. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, so I had some opening questions, and then I looked at this room and I thought, these folks, I think, have stuff to ask. So I'm going to just turn it over to you, I think, first. So I'm going to play Oprah, and if you want to just put your hand up, I will bring you the mic. And you're close to me, so thank you.
Nitrates. What are we doing with them? Because that is a concern of everybody. It affects groundwater, people drink. You go to the Gulf of Mexico, you're looking at what are we doing with that? How is it affecting all you? What are you all doing to address that issue?
Started with a softball.
I'll start right off. I'll start right off because, again, most of our focus is on the health effects. And we know that nitrates, especially nitrates in your drinking water, are a real problem for babies' health. They can cause something called the blue baby syndrome and can be associated with other issues as well. And I know that here in Iowa, you've got lots of people on private wells, which are often not tested, and that nitrate pollution is a pretty major area when someone looks.
So again, Ken Sharp with the State Health Department. I think with respect to nitrates or any of the other water contaminants, and one thing I will just clarify, we actually have an excellent program in the state of Iowa called the Grants to Counties program that we administer through local boards of health. And we have perhaps the most extensive set of data related to private water wells in the nation because of that program. 98 of the 99 counties participate in that. Marshall County has chosen not to. However, we do have extensive data over about a 25 to 30 year period of that data. So one of the things that we have done is we are about 10 years into a program that's supported by the Centers for Disease Control, National Centers for Environmental Health, called the Environmental Public Health Tracking Program. And that program is intended to bring environmental data and health data alongside one another to help better understand potential correlations between environmental contaminants and health outcomes. And if you were to go to the department's website and search for the Iowa Public Health Tracking Portal, we do have a fair amount of data out there that begins to provide that data for the public to look at and become more educated and informed about that. From a regulatory standpoint, the Department of Public Health really has no regulatory function or role as it relates to any of the contaminants. So really, our role prominently is information sharing and getting information out to the community, to local boards of health to help them make some decisions. And we work very closely with those local boards of health to administer that Grants to Counties program so that homeowners do understand that they have options available to test those wells on a regular basis. That test includes total coliform nitrates and arsenic. And so there are some options there. What's interesting is that regardless of the amount of money that we contract out to our local boards of health, only about 75% of those dollars are used in any given year. And so there is money that reverts back into the fund and then is brought back the following year. So there are certainly counties out there that have more room for additional water testing if there is interest and capacity in doing so. So I think the role from a state health department perspective is information sharing and making sure that local boards of health and their citizens have some information about what the water quality trends are, particularly as it relates to those private water wells.
So I would say that every person in this room has contributed about $700 to farm conservation, and that includes every person that's ever lived in the United States since 1930. And in terms of nutrient pollution, we have not gotten our money's worth, and I think we can say in terms of policy and government action, we have failed. There's no doubt about it when it comes to this. And so, I would just say here in Iowa, it's hard for me to say that we've really been serious about solving this. And of course, that is because so much of our economy relies on the ability or the license we've given the system to release nitrate to the environment. In my mind, the corn soybean system can't exist in its current formulation or current structure without being able to lose some nitrate to the environment. And so we've tried to address this through various things. The Senate water bill that was passed last year provides $280 million over 20 years for water quality and other projects here in Iowa to try to improve the condition, and so that's about $14 million a year. And so we know from a student working with Keith that farmers are spending about $70 million a year putting in new drain tile, which is the primary delivery mechanism for nitrate from farm fields to the stream network. And so you don't need to be a genius to figure out that this problem is not going to be corrected under the current framework that we have for trying to solve these things. And so I would just finish by saying, if we want to solve this problem, we're going to have to get a lot more serious than what we are and decide what we're willing to sacrifice to solve it.
I'll add, and I'll turn it over to you. Sure. I'm sure you got an answer. Yeah, I would say that we've seen over the last 150 years that nitrate has increased quite substantially in Iowa streams. So we have very few records that exist from 100 plus years ago. Those that we do showed that nitrate was largely 1 or less than 1 milligram per liter in our major rivers. Those increased to 2 and 3 milligrams per liter in the 1950s, and currently statewide average is probably 7, 8 milligrams per liter across the state. It's been pretty clear. Some of our research has shown that the amount of row crop in a watershed is the #1 predictor for what the stream nitrate is going to be. In fact, if you wanted to estimate what your nitrate would be in your stream, ask yourself what's the percentage of row crop in the watershed, multiply that by 0.1, and that's roughly your mean annual nitrate concentration. It's that firm of a relation. It doesn't mean there are not opportunities for improving that, and we can talk about those later. I think I want to turn it over to our last speaker now.
I guess I get to be the only farmer up here, but I can tell you what we do, and I don't have a lot of facts behind across the entire state, but I know what we do. And I think the biggest thing we got to realize is the soil in the state is, the reason it's good soil is because it's going to be high in nitrate. And what we're trying to do is try to figure out the best ways to put it on. And the biggest factor that we deal with every day is the environment. And we cannot predict the environment. So the things that we're doing is we're variable rating it. As far as what we're trying to do, and I talked about it earlier, is we create management zones on the fields. So we know these zones are going to produce less because of the soil type. We know these zones over here are going to produce more because of the soil type. So what we're doing is we're variable rating the amount of nitrogen that we're putting it on based on what we predict and what the past removal rate has been, following ISU recommendations and other university recommendations for removal rates. Past that, then we're also looking at doing a lot of testing, whether it be stock nitrate testing, plant tissue testing, to monitor how much that nitrate, how much that crop is using, and that's what we're using from year to year. There's a lot of different, it's getting more popular, I guess. There's mainly two ones within the private industry that are trying to use more predicting, more modeling of the weather to determine how much a crop is going to use, how much it's going to be. The other thing we got to realize is we're dealing with a lot of organic matter, and we're big no-till farmers. We try to manage our organic. That organic matter, depending on the weather, depending on the year, is converting the nitrogen that's already in the ground, converting that over for the crop to use. And that's the biggest thing that we have to try to manage and try to understand. So the nitrogen's in the ground. I heard it's, and one of these guys could probably correct me, but I know the average soil is there like 10,000 pounds of nitrogen in the soil naturally. We're putting on 150 pounds. It's very, very limited. But what we can't predict is how much of that natural stuff is being converted over every year because of the soil. We're getting better. We're trying to do more things like no-till, trying to utilize cover crops, things that can help us manage those microbes in that soil to help manage those 10,000 pounds that are already in that soil naturally that are going to be converted over by the microorganisms. Then when the fertilizer that we're putting on, again, it goes back to that variable rate and trying to understand what levels we need and doing the different soil testing and stock nitrate testing. The other thing I was just going to say, as far as the drainage tiles and things, we put in a lot of our own tile, but I used earlier, I think I said probably 80% of it is replacing tile that's already in the ground. There's so much tile in this ground people don't know, and it's been there for hand dug since the 30s. So that's a lot of, you see the whole discussion around tile, a lot of it is replacing the tile that's in there. What we're trying to do with that tile is increase the water holding capacity of that ground so that when we have the big rains that we've had, we have less nutrients washing off the top of the ground and into the watersheds. So we're trying to manage the water holding capacity of that soil and things, the conservation practices, like I mentioned, no-till, filter strips, those are things that we're trying to hold that soil on the ground, because in our mind, the biggest thing we can do is hold that soil on the ground and not let it get washed away. And that's where your nutrients are going to be from that soil loss.
I'd make one follow-up comment to that. I hear the 10,000 pounds argument all the time, and that's not an argument. It's just, it is what it is, However, like I said, the same 10,000 pounds was in our soils in 1900, and the nitrate concentrations were 1 milligram per liter. So clearly, we've changed the conditions to oxidize and leach and move that nitrogen off the land. So, not sure I'm buying that one, but it is what it is. There is a lot of organic nitrogen in our soils. We've been so blessed with that that we are the number one farm state in the world. The country and the place in the world. So can't minimize that. But what we do to that existing organic matter is where the issue is.
I just want to ask the gentleman who talked about how variable rate applies. What fertilizer do you use?
So what we're using is we've switched away from ammonia anhydrous, which is in a nitrate form, and we're using 32%, which is in a nitrate form. We also are using stabilizers when we put that on. Technology's come a long ways as far as the types of stabilizers that can be put in with that. What that does is helps from volatilization, and so that's the stuff we're putting on. We're putting it on right now twice as a crop's needing it. So in our mind, as what we're doing in our operation, it's trying to get it out there closer to when the crop's going to uptake it. So there's less chance of those environmental concerns that I mentioned earlier. And so variable rating, multiple applications, that's how we can try to get it more timely put on when the crop's going to utilize it.
And a follow-up, do you also spread manure?
Not on our operation.
Okay, thank you.
We don't spread manure from a standpoint, we don't have it to spread, I guess is the best way. For our cows are mainly on pasture, and that's not a contained, manure from that side.
In your opinion, what role can the state legislature play in all of this, if any? And I'll just throw that out to whoever wants to respond.
Well, a lot of times we hear, Keith and I work very closely, and we hear what can be done. I always say the low-hanging fruit is this. We have 250,000 acres in the 2-year floodplain, okay, in Iowa. Why are we doing that? So every other year, all the inputs on that ground gone to the Gulf of Mexico. So that's one. We know that a fall tillage has been bad for probably 50 years, okay? Iowa State University has been putting guidance out on this at least since the 1970s. If you take a drive from Des Moines to the Minnesota border on November 1st, you're going to see almost every field is tilled in the fall there. So that's another one. The third one is the MRTN. That's a recommended nitrogen rate Iowa State puts out using their N rate calculator. Anybody can go to it and use it. In Iowa right now for corn after soybeans, it's about 143 pounds per acre, and for corn after corn, I think it's about on the order of 183, something like that. We know every county in Iowa is above the MRTN just with the commercial sales, okay? That's before we ever add in the inputs from manure. So we could try to get farmers to adhere to that recommended rate put out by Iowa State University. And so that, in my mind, is the real low-hanging fruit. The last one I would say is we could better manage manure better. We know that many farmers that are using manure are applying rates that are very quite high. In some counties in Iowa, it might be almost double the MRTN. So that would be the four things. Is that anything the legislature can address? I would think that it could be if the will was there, but I don't think the will is there.
What would the use of fall cover crops do for that nitrate retention by holding possibly the soil in during the time of year when the ground is frozen beneath a slushy topsoil?
So I'll go first, and you can do it from your perspective. Our cropping system, corn and soybeans, is really poorly timed to our rainfall season. So we have vulnerable periods where, without a cover on the ground, all the rainfall occurring in the spring and the fall, there's nothing to intercept it and use that water. So it leaches gets recharged, infiltrates the soil, leaches nitrate, and enters the subsurface system. So what cover crops do is help provide some water utilization with the transpiration from the vegetation itself. It also sequesters and some of the nitrogen in the soil, so it binds it up and uses it in the plant biomass. So it's doing two things there, in addition to the soil erosion reduction that you're seeing. So prior to, the land cover history in Iowa, land use history said that in the 1940s and 50s, we might have been half row crop and half perennial. And we've really gone away from a perennial vegetation on our watersheds. The cover crops add some level of perennialization because we need that ability to sequester the water and the nutrients during vulnerable periods.
Real quick, I'd add to that. I'd agree with everything Dr. Schilling said. We've probably experimented with cover crops for 8 to 10 years. A lot of experimentation, because that's honestly what it is. And like I mentioned earlier, we get one time a year to try this stuff. And then we got to learn from it. The next year we got to try to figure out what worked, didn't, and try to do it again. It's a slow process. There is a lot of benefits to cover crops. The one thing we also have to realize is you got to look at if it's going to be a cover crop that's going to kill off with the frost, or if it's planted in the fall and going to maintain through the winter and grow next spring. And rye would be an example of something that we've utilized where it's going to maintain through the winter and it's going to be grown next spring. Now the next thing is we have to also throw out that argument about what are we going to do with that cover crop, because now you either have to till it under or you got to use chemicals to spray it. There is a few other practices, but they don't work very well as far as rolling and encrypting it. So that's just another, there is pros and cons to it to say that, everything he said is a positive for cover crops. We've seen that. We have tried to no-till right into it after it's been dead. We use either our cows will sometimes graze it off and we'll plant directly into it, or we use chemicals to kill that crop so we can plant usually corn or beans into it. So that's the positives and negatives of it. But it is a big trial and error, and there has been a big push with cover crops in the state, rightfully so. From our standpoint, from my standpoint in our operation, I'd like to see a bigger push on no-till. And I think that would give you a bigger benefit in the long run than maybe the money that's been spent on trying to push people towards cover crops.
Okay, I've got one back here, and then I'll make my way to the front.
I've curiosity on some of the statistics from the public health standpoint. You talked about some of the data that you have on rural wells, or gathering data on rural wells. What percentage of the rural wells that you have are coming back high in nitrate levels above the EPA limit? And then, just for everyone's sake, what is the EPA allowable parts per million in drinking water?
So you're going to put me on the spot and show that I'm not at all prepared to talk about the specifics of that. So I apologize. I've got staff that have that data right at the tips of their fingers. I think one of the things is we look at, so 10 parts per million is really the drinking water standard in terms of consumption. And so from our perspective, I'm trying to recall in terms of the private water wells, I think it's somewhere around 15 to 20% that we're at or above that number in terms of our data.
At least reading a bunch of stuff that I read today, trying to bone up for this, I think the nitrate pollution levels, I think, were higher than the E. coli or the fecal contamination levels in wells. Percentage of wells.
What data were you looking at?
A whole bunch of stuff that my assistant gave me.
Okay. So before we answer right or wrong, I think what we need to do is get information to Brandy and have her share that back out with the audience to make sure. I would encourage you, if you do, you can take a look at that data right on our website. If you go to the Iowa Department of Public Health website and pull up the Iowa Public Health Tracking Program, all of that data for the last number of years is there. And without me trying to guess or correct my colleague here, right or wrong, I'm not going to try to speculate numbers.
Let's just say it's significant. It isn't like 1 or 2%.
The other thing that I think that we have also learned, particularly with private water wells, when we look at things like tolucoliform and to an extent nitrates, oftentimes there are well construction implications that impact that water quality. And I think oftentimes we overlook the value and the importance of looking at well construction standards and the condition of existing wells. When we have a well sitting in a frost pit, for example, with no meaningful cap, and it's sitting 50 feet perhaps from an old failed on-site septic system, it's hard to take criticism of what's happening on the farm practices around it when we have something as direct as and we've seen this, where you go in and correct that wellhead deficiency, and the nitrate levels immediately improve, and what happens is every time you flush that toilet, and what's in that toilet goes to your septic tank and then makes its way through the ground and into the private water well. We've seen that. And so I think one of the things that we always remind folks when we look at that private water well data, because we have had such a long history of use of private water wells in the state, we always want to make sure we remind ourselves to look at those water construction or the private well construction standards and any deficiencies that are there. And the program that I talked about earlier, the Grants to Counties program, not only provides opportunities to test those wells, but there's also cost-sharing reimbursement to cover the correction costs associated with that. So I apologize I didn't have data immediately available, but if you do go to our website, that information will be there.
Just a quick follow-up. Based on
I'm going to let you go. I just got one thing. I don't know where your follow-up is going. So before I lose the topic, the one thing about groundwater nitrate in Iowa is it's not evenly distributed, both spatially and vertically. So not all wells are equally impacted, compared to, a deep Jordan well that the city of Cedar Rapids uses. Really no impact on surface activities because it's 1,000 feet below the ground, separated by shale confining units. So what we're talking about here is shallow water wells, and also wells that receive their water from fractured limestone that has the ability to transmit water much quicker. So we've seen in Iowa that if there's a separation distance of roughly, say 50 feet of glacial till, that's the fine-grained glacial sediments, there's very little impact on the groundwater, the well, if the wells are adequately constructed. So know that it's not uniform across the state. There's areas that are much more vulnerable than others, and it's usually shallow wells and sand and gravel aquifers and wells that are tapping fractured carbonate bedrock.
I guess my follow-up question was...
Can I just give you some numbers before you follow up? Because I found the citations, and this is something that was published in April 24th of this year. It was a report by the Environmental Working Group, so take it from where it comes. But deeper wells, in general, have less bacterial contamination. That makes sense. Absolutely. And I was wrong about the percent of nitrate in the wells. So the well vulnerability for nitrates is above 10, which is the regulatory limit, is in the neighborhood of about 15%, 10 to 15%, and varies from year to year. But if you go up to those that are at 5, which is not so far from 10, you'd rather not have it that high. That's up as high as almost 30%, certainly 25 to 30% at times. So I knew I read it, I just didn't remember the numbers exactly.
I guess my follow-up question was from a public health standpoint. You talked about the impacts of nitrate on things like blue baby syndrome and other health effects. Do we have any data on how many cases of that we have in Iowa a year, or medical cases of issue directly related to water quality issues?
So specific to methemoglobinemia or blue baby syndrome, I think the last case that we had was in the late 70s or early 80s. There have been other cases of methemoglobinemia, but they were not tied to drinking water. So it has been 30 plus years or more since the last documented case of blue baby syndrome as a case of drinking private water well. I think the other things that we see, there's emerging data and reports about linkages between certain female cancers and nitrates. We're watching that closely. We are not a research institution, but we do look at organizations like the Center for Health Effects of Environmental Contaminants at the University of Iowa, the work that the College of Public Health is doing in other research communities to watch that trend. And I think what we need to do is watch that closely and understand in terms of messaging to the public about the importance of understanding the quality of their water and how that may impact long-term health implications. But the acute diseases like methemoglobinemia, we just are not seeing those cases in any level of frequency in Iowa. And that is, to be clear, a mandatorily reportable illness in the state. So if it does occur, we should know about it. And like I say, we do have a handful of cases that have been reported over the years, but it's typically some other exposure that is oftentimes dealing with food or some other exposure.
I just want to make a quick comment before we move on. So I'm a younger mother, I guess I can't say young anymore, but of 2 young boys, and we've lived on our property for over 10 years now. I actually know it's my family that's farmed around it. So our home is surrounded by crop ground. It's been farmed by our family for over 35 years, and worked with my pediatrician when my children were both young, so they're 8 and 5 now. And so had the water actually tested by the University of Iowa. So my pediatrician actually asked me to do that, and I'm so glad that she did. But I do want to just let you know that there were no reportable concerns. She was actually happy. I unfortunately had to mixed formula for them, and so I had to use water from our well every single day. And again, that was farm ground completely surrounding us, and in some cases actually overlapping part of the property for well over 35 years. So I think there's a strong case for, and exactly that's one example, right? There's a lot of data out there, but for upping some of our agricultural practices, as Tim's mentioning.
Hi, thank you for being here. This is very helpful and informative, and I think every change begins with awareness. Last year I met with Director Troutman of the DNR and Bill Ime, who was the retiring gentleman from the IDALS, Iowa Department of Land Stewardship. And I asked him, I said, what's it going to take to move the dial on this issue? And Bill Ime said, we need a crisis. And he said, that's what it's going to take. We need a crisis. If you get a crisis, things will change. And I said, well, I think we have it. Look at the Gulf, right? We have a crisis. Iowa contributes 40 to 45% of the nitrates that go down that river. I could talk at length at this, but I just, a little bit of a couple things. Chris, I read your blogs. I think you do a great job. And I think, again, the education that this provides is invaluable, and what we need to take from this is try to move the dial on it. Our farm is up in northeast Iowa by Waukon. 3 years ago, the gentleman bought the farm right across the creek from it, the one that I own, that's been in our family for 5 generations. And he's the 3rd largest hog producer in the state. And we worked, Bob Lieber at the time was the geologist. He came up there. Gazette came up there. We tried to stop this. We couldn't stop this. It is not against farming. I made that very clear. It's not against farming. In North Carolina, I think you have about 3,000 or 4,000 CAFOs. We've got over 10,000. And Mr. Braylick, if everybody could farm like you, we wouldn't have a problem, really. I just commend you for what you're doing. And I've read up too that it takes about 10 years of cover crop to raise your organic matter 1%. That's good, and at the rate we're going and converting to cover crops, it'll take about 1,000 years to get every farmer to doing in Iowa what you're doing right now. So it's a start. You're doing a great job. In Iowa, we produce as much manure from the CAFOs of about 168 million people, all right? That's half of the United States. None of it is treated, it's put on the fields. And to the extent it isn't against farming, the level that this producer produces that now has built 2 large confinements across the creek from our farm, it's 1.5 miles from 2 natural producing trout streams. We did everything we could to stop this. It went up to the Attorney General's office. We couldn't stop it. The director of the DNR, Chuck Gibb at the time, had a discretion rule which he chose not to use, not to stop it, and there's reasons for that. But here's the thing. They look at me, the current director, and Bill Ime says, it takes a crisis. We've got it. In Northeast Iowa, in the Driftless area, there was an article 2 years ago written in one of the national fishing magazines. It said, where are the best fishing places in this country? It was number 4th on the list. Of all the trout places in Wyoming and wherever you go to fish, it was number 4. My gosh, if any other state had this as a natural resource, they would be trying to protect it. Let's make it about economics. Donnie Burlick, who was a supervisor on Cresco, told me this 2 years ago. He said, as they haul the manure out on these streams, just one thing and I'll be done, because I have a question, but this is so frustrating to me. I've been on these roundtables, I've talked at this, but this is so frustrating. Let's make it about money. Donnie Burlick told me this, when they take the manure out onto when they haul the manures on the county roads, the county has to spend about $5,000 per mile to maintain this. From the large producers, they get about $300 per mile to maintain those roads. We're all subsidizing it, okay? This gentleman that owns this farm across from us sells over $100 million worth of pigs a year. If it's economics, at some point they were overbuilt, and like we've seen in the dairy industry right now, it gets too overbuilt and the price comes down, and then they stop. So my question to you is, what can we do beyond awareness to move the dial on this? Because we need to, because I say we have the crisis. This is helpful, and each of you are doing a wonderful job. I commend you for being here, I really do, and this is how we learn to move the dial. But we got to move it quickly.
One thing I just like to say, and I don't have the answer, but what is water quality? We all talk about it, we all say how it's a problem. I'm not sure we can definitely define it and put, that you guys have done a lot of work on trying to figure out where it's at and where but it's a broad term. It's kind of like when you say it's all natural. What's all natural mean? And so in my mind, as an industry, we probably have to do a better job and come up, there's a lot of collaborations going on, not just within universities and the government, private or the Corn Growers Association and their partnerships, with the Soil Health Partnership, On-Farm Network, through the Soybean Association, Practical Farmers of Iowa. There's a lot of entities working on this, but I'm not sure they're working together enough to put a true definition on it and a true definition of what needs to be done or what the goals need to be. That's something I think we need to do a better job of, is my personal opinion.
So I just want to make one comment about the CAFOs, or the other way, intensive livestock operations, although we all know we're talking about hog farms. I have to tell you, compared to North Carolina, Iowa is a model. Now, that may, even models can get better than they are, but in North Carolina, we're still spraying the manure all over fields. It's not being injected, for example. We still have open lagoons, nothing closed. Every time we have a hurricane, the lagoons are breached, and we also lose hogs as well that are flooded out. So, I think Iowa has moved ahead and adopted better requirements, maybe not where it needs to be, but at least you're moving in the right direction, and I wish I could take some of this back to North Carolina. And what it's going to take, I agree, it takes a crisis and it takes will. But in North Carolina, we've had 2 hurricanes last fall, which flooded the major hog farm areas. We had another hurricane just 2 years ago. They hadn't even recovered yet, and yet things haven't changed very rapidly.
So I'll say, firstly, I do not think it will take a crisis. I think we need to be honest with ourselves about a lot of things, and so I sympathize with farmers quite a lot, because I never have met a farmer that was satisfied with the economic outcomes that he or she is getting based on their capital investment. And I think you can look at what farmers make and what they have invested, and it's not large. And then we also look at the public who is not getting the environmental outcomes that they want. And so the public isn't getting the environmental outcomes that they want. The farmer isn't getting the economic outcomes that they want. So who is getting the outcomes that they want from this system? Okay, and I would say therein lies your problem. And so that is the component of all this that needs to be addressed. Secondly, I'll say is, yes, we can objectively define water quality. And in fact, we have done it many times. We know what standards or levels of nutrients, for example, in streams are harmful to aquatic life. We know what those levels are. We've defined them. We know what sort of levels of nutrients in lakes that we need to have to reduce the incidence of algae blooms. We know that. I was funded by Iowa DNR to rewrite the water quality index for the state. And so with another fellow, I developed an equation that objectively defined water quality. That's never been adopted to my knowledge. It's dead. It sits in a notebook on a shelf somewhere. So we have objective measures of water quality. We know what they are, but none of those measures gets implemented in any meaningful way because the industry does not want measures. And so as soon as you assign a measure or an objective number to a stream, that automatically is seen by the industry as sort of a pathway to regulation. And so as a consequence of that, we are unable to define objective measures even though the scientists know what they are. In terms of the livestock industry, one thing I say, I'm not an authority on the methods in North Carolina. I know there's about 9 million hogs there, and I know there's about 23 million here. And I don't focus so much on the methods of what is being done with livestock production. What I will say is the scale of it is what we need to look at. And so some of these counties have so many hogs that it's just, very difficult for these farmers to manage the manure simply because the available fields to put the manure are not there. And the other thing is, manure is more difficult to manage than commercial fertilizer is. Any farmer knows that. And we know that the availability of manure in Iowa does not affect the sales of commercial fertilizer. We know that. That's an objective thing that we know. And so if we're going to have all these livestock here, and manure is a good fertilizer, in many ways superior to commercial fertilizer, not against manure. But if we're going to do this at the scale that we're doing it, we're going to have to do things exactly right, okay? Every farmer's going to have to do things perfectly, and without any meaningful framework or regulation, how do we get there? And I think that's a big question.
Mr. Jones, just a quick thing to add in your response. I think you just answered your own question, and I just could add one other thing. Who's winning on this? You're right, there's so much manure that it can be applied. And I would just have to say who's winning are the Monsantos of the world and the chemical companies. And if we look at their earnings, every year they make money. And so there is enough nitrogen if they just apply it the right way. So that was my only comment. But that's hard to do, I understand that, because the weather has to cooperate.
If I can, so just to demonstrate the effectiveness of the tracking program, I did just pull up on my phone the data. We do have data dating back to 2000 by year, statewide average, and I believe you can also break that down by county. We've had a few spikes in there. I think those were largely related to studies that were particularly focused in kind of the northeast Iowa area, where we would expect to see some of the higher nitrate levels because of the topography. But generally speaking, the annual rate has ranged from about 11% to about 15 to 18% annually during that time frame, with a slight trend upwards over that 2000 to 2018 time frame. So if you're bored with the conversation that's happening right now, or if you'd like to later tonight or tomorrow, just do a quick search for Iowa Public Health Tracking, and there's some various tabs in there in the data sets. You can take a look at that data yourself.
Hi, we have really good research on the downstream impacts of cover crops and no-till systems. But we also have, I think, really good long-term research on increased crop rotations. And so I'm curious to hear your opinions on, what the barriers are to increasing crop rotations here in the state. Thank you.
Economics, I think, is probably the biggest thing. We can grow a lot of corn and beans on this ground, and that is the most efficient and the most profitable. And you talk about hay, you talk about other crops. We don't have as much livestock around. Years ago, everybody had their 40 acres alfalfa, they had their oats, they rotated things. Well, 40 years ago, everybody had hogs, everybody had cattle. So the same argument discussion we're having, there's not as much livestock that is so widespread, and that's caused the crop rotations to change over the years. That's the biggest thing, but bottom line, it comes down to the fact that the practices that we use, the things that the market is demanding, is corn and soybeans. And a big thing that comes into this is property values. Look at what a cost per acre of ground has done over the years. This is highly productive ground. It's going to be used for the most productive reasons. But yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you on rotations. I do think that would have some value. But again, if I'm going to grow 40 acres of oats or 200 acres of oats, I got to have something to do with it. And if I don't have a market for it, then I'm not going to be doing it long. So it doesn't really even matter that I did it in the first place.
Yeah, so we don't have the infrastructure here to support other crops, is, I think, in my mind, and people that are interested in water quality, they don't think about this system we've created to support the corn soy system. And so the co-op system and the other retailers, the transportation system, the trucking industry, the rail industry, the lock and dam system on the Mississippi River, the equipment manufacturers, the seed sales, all these things have been built up around the corn and soybean system, sort of in concert or in synchrony with the evolution of the corn soybean system. And so these farmers are paralyzed sort of into this system. It's like this gentleman says, yeah, if you grow alfalfa, well, you got to have something that can eat it. And if you don't have cattle, well, what are you going to do with it? And if Quaker Oats won't buy oats from Iowa, which they won't, what are you going to do with those oats? And so we have all this infrastructure that sort of keeps us in a straitjacket here.
Example of that would be the ethanol plants. You know, an example of that would be the ethanol plants, and you look at the boom in the ethanol industry that's going in everybody's vehicles. That's a corn-driven market.
This is a huge leap away, but as I listen to this, like Will Rogers used to say, and all I know is what I read in the newspapers and an occasional blog and so on and so on. But it seems to me there is a crisis, but it's a bigger crisis, and that is a crisis of how people eat. And what in the world are we squandering our Iowa topsoil and trying? It doesn't seem sustainable to me, and with the gradual loss of topsoil. Why are we addicted to corn and soybeans to feed animals? That just seems to me insane that we're doing that. And 23 million hogs pooping bravely, you know, every day here. And who needs that? There needs to be some giant leap in rethinking industrial agriculture, it seems to me. And I realize that's an uncomfortable, inconvenient truth, but I just don't see any other solution.
I think from a large-scale topic that I don't want to get into today, but we're feeding those animals not just to feed them, that's the protein that we're eating and servicing the people around the world with. So it's not just because...
If people were to stop eating so many animals, it would resolve that problem.
Correct, and that's not the discussion I want to get into today.
I don't think any of us really want to get into that discussion per se, but I do want to say that I think if you look 20 years forward, there are going to be major changes that occur over those 20 years, because with the level of all kinds of contamination and pollution that's occurring around the globe, we have a very small world, and we're going to have to rethink many things that we do, whether it's the food that we eat or the kind of transportation that we use or the way that we heat our homes, etc. I think 20 years from now is going to be a very different world. Certainly it's very different now than it was 20 years ago.
So, excuse me, I'll say that almost since the time that we've started growing corn in this country, we've grown too much of it, more than what we needed. And so, you know, Iowa's the best place on earth to grow corn, and so our farmers consider it their birthright to grow that. And so this is the best place to do it. You know, they want to do it here. And if you talk to farmers, they love seeing the corn go into the bin when they're harvesting it. That's a good feeling. And so there's an aesthetic quality, I think, to growing corn that farmers have.
I grew up on a farm.
And so,
I remember that clearly.
and so, as I said, since we started growing corn here, we've been trying to figure out what to do with it. And so we have this attitude that, you know, we can grow as much as we want, and the rest of the world should accommodate that. And that's been good for us. It's been good for the farmers here, and it's been good for the rest of us that live here for the most part. You know, how do we deal with that going into the future? Do we continue to find more markets and more products that can accommodate our pile, is what I'll say? Or do we, you know, retire some acres, or do we grow something else? And so these farmers react to economic factors just like the rest of us, and their actions are logical. And so if it's logical for them to grow corn, they're going to do it. If it's logical for them to grow something else, they're going to do it. But that change is going to have to originate in policy.
And I think you both have kind of alluded to it. We're not in a state or a U.S. market anymore. Everything we do is from a global side. And so that's continuing to change every year. The population increase in some of these countries, and they're changed from the type of protein that they eat. That's affecting the markets. That's affecting the crops that we're growing. That's affecting the livestock that we're producing. It's a global market.
I'd like to return to a point that we started with, and that is organic nitrogen in the soil, and the observation that the amount seems not to have changed over the last 100 years, but we have a much more runoff. And I was wondering if you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the difference is that 100 years ago there was a lot of perennials growing on the landscape, and so their roots were there year-round. When we grow a corn crop and we harvest the shoot, the root remains in the soil and it decomposes. And it's got the corn plants have massive root systems, and so to say, oh, it's natural, it's really just the residue of last year's crop that is whose decomposition leads to nitrate production because of the aeration that we get from tillage as well as tiling. Did I miss anything? Is that
No, I think
right?
you actually covered a lot of issues in that comment. So, we can tweak some of the assumptions you were making, but largely, there's a lot of truth to it. So, we have lost a lot of our topsoil because of erosion. So our soils back in perennial days were much thicker than they are today.
I've got time for 2 more questions. This gentleman's waiting a long time, David Osterberg. And I know there are a lot more, so I really encourage you to stick around and come up and ask. Sorry, we don't have time to get back around to everybody. And I'm going to ask you both to be quick.
Just a footnote to the discussion that you all were just having. Iowa Public Radio, I saw the article today, reported on research that's been done that shows that nitrates in drinking water at levels below the 10 parts per million is associated with cancer and birth defects. So you might want to check the research that they reported on and update your sensibilities about that.
I just want to mention that often regulatory limits, for example, in drinking water, are based upon what's readily doable, not necessarily what's really safe.
My question is, since Iowa's soil is so good, why don't farmers grow what the soil will support instead of creating problems for not only our state but people downriver as well?
I think that's kind of what has happened, because over the years we have grown what the soil can support, and that's corn and soybeans. And then that brings up some of the things that,
But you add stuff. It's just, keep adding stuff.
I want to be, it's got to be profitable or you're not going to be able to do it. It's that simple. So it doesn't matter whatever industry you're in, you have to be profitable or you're not going to be doing it. So again, like he said, we have become a corn soybean state, and I don't know what it will take to change that, but the economics are telling us because the soil can produce it, that's what we're going to do, or that's what the market is telling us we need to do.
All right, David Osterberg, I'm going to give you the last question, and you be quick too.
This is not my first one of these. This is not my first rodeo, that's right. And when I come to these, it's very similar. We have some experts, and they put out great data. Here's one more piece. 36 million acres in Iowa, 24 million is corn or beans. That's how much of a problem the agricultural part is. And Iowa State University has already said that 91% of the N comes from non-point sources, and that's rural. That's farming. So, and then when you have these kinds of things, you always get a real good farmer. Brolik Farms is well known for being great farmers or conservationists. I'm sitting next to Mike, who's another good farmer. I've never seen a bad farmer on one of these panels. but by golly, we've got a bunch of them.
Tim, how do we get them?
So I'll just say this. You can do everything right and still have a lot of nitrate come out of your tiles. But we see that all the time, okay? And it's the system here. And so I say this all the time, we try to treat the symptoms of this, and we don't try to treat the underlying disease, okay? And so we know farmers can do cover crops, they can do variable rate and what have you, and still have high nitrate come from their tiles. So what does that tell us, okay? That tells us there's something wrong with the system here.
I'd just like to add in too that you talk about, bad farmers out there, but over 50% of this ground is rented. And what's happening, and it will continue to happen, is we're having more and more absentee landowners. That landowner was transitioned down to that daughter or son who now lives in California or whatever. They don't care about the ground, they don't care about conservation. All they care about is the check they get in the mail. So what that forces people to do is forget about conservation, because you have to farm fence row to fence row. And by that I mean there needs to be a waterway there needs to be a filter strip. I can't afford to do that. I got to farm the whole field. And so probably the biggest thing when we talk about this is this land is going to continue to transition over to the next generation. That generation has not been on the farm, and a lot of them have not been raised on the farm. So they're looking at the dollars. And so a lot of this accountability, we talk about producers, a lot of the accountability needs to come back to the landowners.
Thank you so much. My name is Sanja. Everybody knows me as Sanja from Croatia for obvious reasons. And I have two quick questions for you. The first one is, what is being done, if anything, at the state level to abandon the outdated practice of fluoridation of our municipal water? All of us know that fluoride is a neurotoxin. So that is one first question. And the other question is, I'm curious, are there any places in Iowa at all where one can go for a hike with their family, stop by and drink water right there? And my kids grew up watching Little House on the Prairie, and they always thought how wonderful it would be if we could just grab some water from the nearby stream or lake.
I'll take the fluoridation. Many people believe that fluoridation of drinking water has been an extremely effective public health measure. However, we are actually sending a systematic review of the neurotoxicity of fluoride to the National Academy for them to review all of the stuff that we've pulled together to answer the question whether at the levels that the Public Health Service now recommends for fluoridation, and those levels were dropped in 2015 from 1.2 to 0.7 parts per million, whether in fact that level is problematic. We know that high levels are definitely neurotoxic. Really the questions are at levels that are being used. So I think stay tuned. I think we may have some better answers for that for you by the fall.
Hey, can you drink directly from a stream anywhere in Iowa?
Probably not.
No. Yeah.
I don't think you can do it almost anywhere in the United
That's true.
States.
I can't do it anywhere.
There are places you can still do it in some of the Balkans, for example.
Yeah. If we could please give these wonderful folks a big round of applause. Thank you so much. Every one of these folks knows their stuff inside and out, but it takes a certain amount of courage to come into a session like this in a community that isn't yours in many cases and put yourself on the spot. So I'm really grateful that we could have this conversation. I'm always grateful to have these conversations in communities in Iowa because I think we have a remarkably smart group of state residents and people turn out and they ask great questions. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
And take care.
Thank you.